What happens when a woman who has everything meets the one man who refuses to bow down to her wealth and beauty? My name is Takoda Tahoma, and I am Apache. In the language of my people, my name means friend of all. But the white settlers around these parts know me as the man who can tame any wild horse that roams the Arizona desert. I work at the Sterling Ranch, not because I need their money, but because it keeps me close to the land my ancestors once called home freely. The year is 1885, and the world is changing faster than a summer storm in the canyon. But some things, like pride, honor, and the fire that burns in a warrior's heart, those never change. Before we begin, get comfortable on the sofa or in bed. And if you're working or cooking, just let us know where you're watching from and enjoy this amazing story. The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and crimson when I first heard the sound that would change everything. The clatter of an expensive carriage rolling up the dusty path to Thomas Sterling's ranch. I was in the main corral, working with a particularly stubborn Mustang that had been giving the other hands trouble for weeks. The horse was beautiful, wild, and completely untamed, much like someone else I was about to meet. "Easy, brother," I whispered to the stallion in Apache, my hands steady on the rope. The animal's eyes were full of fire, but I could see the intelligence there too. Respect had to be earned, not forced. From the corner of my eye, I saw Thomas Sterling hurrying toward the approaching carriage, smoothing down his silver hair and adjusting his best vest. The man was nervous, which was unusual for someone who owned one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. "That'll be my niece from back east," he had mentioned to me the day before. "Victoria Sterling, coming out here for some kind of adventure," she says. "Rich girl looking for excitement." He had shaken his head with a mixture of affection and concern. "Lord knows what kind of trouble a city woman will find out here." The carriage door opened, and out stepped the most striking woman I had ever seen. She was tall and elegant, with golden hair that caught the morning light like spun silk. Her dress was the finest blue velvet I had ever laid eyes on, with more buttons and lace than seemed practical for ranch life. But it was her eyes that caught my attention, green as spring grass, and filled with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. She surveyed the ranch like a queen examining her domain, her gaze sweeping over the adobe buildings, the corrals, and finally landing on me. For a moment, our eyes met across the dusty yard, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a challenge that had nothing to do with breaking horses. "Uncle Thomas." Her voice carried across the yard, cultured and melodious, but with an edge of command. "This place is even more rustic than I imagined. How wonderfully primitive." Thomas Sterling embraced his niece warmly, but I could see the worry lines around his eyes deepen. "Victoria, my dear, welcome to Arizona. I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Nothing I couldn't handle," she replied with a laugh that sounded like silver bells. "Though I must say, I'm eager to see what passes for entertainment in this wilderness. Surely there must be some local color to amuse me." That's when her gaze found me again. I had turned my attention back to the Mustang, but I could feel her eyes on me like the heat of the midday sun. The horse was finally beginning to respond to my gentle pressure, his wild spirit starting to trust rather than fight. "Uncle," Victoria's voice had dropped to what she probably thought was a whisper, but sound carries far in the desert air. "Who is that magnificent specimen in the corral? Please tell me he's not married." Thomas Sterling's face went pale. "Victoria, that's Takoda. He's Apache. One of the best horse trainers in the territory, but—" "Apache?" The word rolled off her tongue like she was tasting something exotic and forbidden. "How thrilling. I've read about Indian warriors in the papers back east. They're supposed to be so untamed and dangerous." I couldn't help but smile grimly at that. If she only knew how many of those newspaper stories were nothing but lies and sensationalism, designed to sell papers to bored Eastern socialites looking for vicarious adventure. "Victoria," her uncle said more urgently, "you need to understand something about the situation out here. Relations between the settlers and the Apache are complicated. There's been a lot of bloodshed on both sides. Takoda is respected because of his skills, but many folks around here still don't trust. "Oh, uncle, don't be such an old worrier," she interrupted with a wave of her gloved hand. "I'm not some sheltered flower. I can handle myself around any man, savage or civilized. In fact, I find the prospect rather exciting." The word savage hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my face neutral. I had heard it countless times before, usually from men who wouldn't last a day surviving in the desert, with nothing but their wits and the clothes on their backs. But somehow, hearing it from this beautiful, privileged woman stung in a way I hadn't expected. I finished my work with the Mustang and began walking toward the main house to report to Thomas, as was my daily routine. As I approached, Victoria Sterling stepped directly into my path, her chin raised in a gesture of imperious confidence. "You must be Takoda," she said, looking me up and down with the same appraising gaze she might use when examining a piece of expensive jewelry. "I'm Victoria Sterling, Thomas's niece. I've heard you're quite skilled with horses." "Miss Sterling," I replied with a polite nod, keeping my voice neutral and my hands at my sides. "Your uncle speaks of you often. Welcome to Arizona." She seemed surprised by my English, which was as clear and educated as her own. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't a man who could speak with the same refinement she was used to in her Boston drawing rooms. "How articulate," she said, and I could hear the condescension wrapped in false surprise. "I suppose you learned English from the missionaries." "I learned English because knowledge is power," I replied evenly. "And power is something every man should possess, regardless of the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth." Her green eyes flashed with something that might have been interest or annoyance. I couldn't tell which. "How philosophical. And how do you feel about taking orders from your betters?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Sterling looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground, and I could see several of the ranch hands had stopped their work to watch our exchange. I took a step closer to her, close enough that I could smell the expensive perfume she wore, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. When I spoke, my voice was quiet, but carried the weight of generations of warrior pride. "Miss Sterling, I take orders from men I respect, and I follow the path my conscience sets before me. As for betters, well, I've found that a person's worth isn't measured by the weight of their purse or the fineness of their clothes. It's measured by their actions, their honor, and their willingness to stand by their principles when the world tries to break them down." She stared at me for a long moment, her mouth slightly open in shock. Clearly, no one had ever spoken to her like that before. Around us, the ranch hands had gone completely silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, to my surprise, she smiled, not the practiced social smile I had seen her give her uncle, but something genuine and delighted, like a child who had just discovered a new game. "Well," she said, her voice filled with something that sounded dangerously like excitement, "this is going to be much more interesting than I thought." And as she turned and walked away, her velvet skirts swishing in the dust, I realized that Victoria Sterling was going to be trouble, the kind of beautiful, complicated trouble that could destroy a man's carefully ordered world. The worst part was, I found myself looking forward to it. Chapter 2. 3 days had passed since Victoria Sterling's arrival, and the woman was like a force of nature sweeping through the ranch. She had already rearranged her uncle's parlor, scandalized the cook by attempting to help in the kitchen while wearing silk gloves, and somehow convinced 2 of the younger ranch hands to compete for her attention by seeing who could rope a calf faster. But it was her constant presence around the horse corrals that had me on edge. Every morning, she would appear dressed in riding clothes that probably cost more than most men made in a year, tailored pants that shocked the local women, and a fitted jacket that emphasized every curve of her figure. She would perch on the corral fence like some exotic bird and watch me work with the horses, making observations and asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and her complete ignorance of the realities of frontier life. "Don't you find it terribly boring, doing the same thing every day?" she asked on the third morning, swinging her legs from her perch on the fence rail. "In Boston, I have something different planned every day. Theatre, social calls, shopping, charitable committees. Surely you must crave more excitement than this." I was working with a young mare that had been abused by her previous owner. Trust was everything with horses like this. One wrong move, one moment of impatience, and all progress would be lost. Much like dealing with beautiful, privileged women who thought the world existed for their entertainment. "There is excitement in helping a wounded spirit learn to trust again," I replied, keeping my attention on the mare. "But I suppose that might be difficult to understand for someone who has never had to earn trust, who expects it as a birthright." She was quiet for a moment, and when I glanced her way, I saw something flicker across her face. Hurt, maybe, or recognition. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You think you have me all figured out, don't you?" she said, her voice losing some of its playful tone. "The spoiled rich girl who has never faced a real challenge in her life. Have you?" I asked, finally turning to face her directly. "Faced a real challenge, I mean." Her green eyes flashed with anger, and she slid down from the fence to stand toe-to-toe with me, her chin raised defiantly. "You know nothing about my life or the challenges I've faced." "Then enlighten me," I said calmly. "What great hardships has Victoria Sterling overcome?" For a moment, I thought she might actually tell me something real, something beyond the surface. But then her expression hardened, and she gave me that practiced smile again, the one that revealed nothing and promised everything. "You'd like that, wouldn't you? To hear all my secrets, to find some weakness you could exploit." She circled me slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "But I'm not that easy to crack, Takoda. I'm much stronger than you think." "Strength isn't the same thing as hardness," I replied. "And walls built to keep others out usually end up keeping you trapped inside." She stopped circling and stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You talk like some sort of philosopher. Where does an Apache horse trainer learn to speak like that?" "Books," I said simply. "Your uncle has an extensive library, and he's generous about sharing it. Turns out the savage can read." She had the grace to look embarrassed at that. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," I interrupted, but not unkindly. "It's what you've been taught to expect. The question is whether you're brave enough to see past those expectations." Before she could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A group of men rode into the ranch yard, and I immediately recognized trouble when I saw it. Jake Morrison led the group. He was Thomas Sterling's foreman, but more importantly, he was a man who made no secret of his hatred for anyone who wasn't white and Christian. Morrison dismounted and approached us, his pale eyes fixed on Victoria with obvious appreciation and on me with barely concealed hostility. "Miss Sterling, you shouldn't be out here alone with—" He paused, his gaze raking over me with disgust. "Well, you shouldn't be unescorted." Victoria's spine stiffened, and I saw a flash of the steel beneath her silk exterior. "Mr. Morrison, I'm perfectly capable of deciding where I choose to spend my time and with whom." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't understand the dangers," Morrison began. "What dangers?" Victoria's voice had gone cold as winter wind. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Takoda poses some sort of threat to me?" "Nada." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, and I felt every muscle in my body tense for action. I had learned long ago to read the signs of violence before it erupted, and this man was looking for an excuse to use that weapon. "I'm saying he ain't like us," Morrison said, his voice low and ugly. "His people have been raiding settlements, killing innocent folks. Just 'cause he acts civilized don't mean he is civilized. You can't trust a savage, no matter how fancy his English is." The word hit the air like a slap, and I saw Victoria flinch as if she had been struck. For a moment, no one moved. Then she stepped forward, placing herself between Morrison and me. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from generations of wealth and power. "You will not use that word in my presence again, and you will treat Mr. Takoda with the respect due to any employee of this ranch." Morrison's face flushed red with anger and humiliation. "Miss Sterling, you don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," she cut him off. "A man who does his job well and treats everyone with courtesy, and another man who seems determined to create problems where none exist." She turned to look at me, and in that moment, something passed between us. An understanding, perhaps, or the first crack in the walls we had both built around ourselves. "Takoda," she said formally, "would you be so kind as to show me how you train the horses? I find myself quite fascinated by your methods." "Joe." It was a dismissal of Morrison as clear as any royal decree, and everyone present knew it. The foreman's face went from red to purple, and his hand moved closer to his gun. "You're making a mistake, Miss Sterling," he said through gritted teeth. "And when something happens, don't come crying to me for help." He mounted his horse and rode away with his men, but not before giving me a look that promised this wasn't over. I had made an enemy today, but I had also gained something unexpected. An ally in the last place I would have thought to look for one. Victoria watched them ride away, then turned back to me with a shaky smile. "Well, that was unpleasant." "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. "Morrison is not a man to cross lightly." "Neither am I," she replied, and for the first time since meeting her, I believed it. "Besides, I've never liked bullies, regardless of their color or social standing." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us processing what had just happened. The dynamic between us had shifted somehow, become less of a game and more of something real. "Why did you defend me?" I asked. She looked at me with those green eyes that seemed to see more than she let on. "Maybe because you're the first person in years who's spoken to me like I have a brain instead of just a bank account. Or maybe because I'm tired of people thinking they know who I am without bothering to find out." There was a vulnerability in her voice that I hadn't heard before, a crack in the armor of confidence she wore like expensive jewelry. And in that moment, I realized that Victoria Sterling might be just as trapped by others' expectations as I was. "Your uncle will hear about this," I warned her. "Morrison won't let it rest." She lifted her chin in that gesture I was beginning to recognize as her battle stance. "Then I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." As she walked away, her head held high, despite the trouble brewing on the horizon. I found myself watching her with new eyes. The spoiled, rich girl was still there, but underneath I was beginning to glimpse something else, a woman of strength and principle who had spent so long playing a role that she might have forgotten who she really was. The question was, would she have the courage to find out? Chapter 3. The storm that had been building since Victoria's confrontation with Morrison broke 2 days later, and it came from an unexpected direction. I was in the barn, mending a broken bridle by lamplight, when Thomas Sterling found me. The older man looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in days, and the worry lines around his eyes had deepened into permanent creases. "Takoda, we need to talk," he said, settling heavily onto a hay bale. "There's been developments." I set down my leatherwork and waited. In my experience, when white men said they needed to talk, it rarely meant good news for someone like me. "Morrison's been filling my ears with poison," Thomas continued, rubbing his temples. "Says you've been inappropriate with Victoria, that you're taking advantage of her curiosity about Indian customs to get close to her. He's threatening to take his complaints to the territorial marshal if I don't address the situation." "And what does Victoria say about these accusations?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew the answer. Thomas's laugh was bitter. "Victoria says Morrison is a small-minded bigot who should mind his own business. She's threatened to cut short her visit and return to Boston if I so much as suggest she can't speak to whomever she pleases." "Then what's the problem?" The ranch owner looked at me with eyes full of pain and conflict. "The problem is that Morrison's not wrong about everything. I've seen the way you two look at each other, Takoda. I've seen how she lights up when you're around, and how you watch her when you think no one's looking. Hell, half the territory is talking about it. I felt my jaw clench. Talking about what exactly? About how Thomas Sterling's niece has taken a fancy to the Apache horse trainer. About how she defended you against Morrison in front of half the ranch hands. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, son, and by the time they reach the territorial capital, they'll be saying, "You've compromised her reputation." The weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. In the white man's world, a woman's reputation was everything, and Victoria's association with me, no matter how innocent, could destroy her social standing. But more than that, it could get us both killed. There were plenty of men like Morrison who would see our friendship as a threat to the natural order of things. "What are you asking me to do?" I said quietly. "I'm asking you to stay away from her," Thomas replied, his voice heavy with regret. "For her sake as much as yours. She's young and headstrong, and she doesn't understand how dangerous this situation could become. But you do, don't you?" I nodded slowly. I had seen what happened to Indians who forgot their place in white society, had heard the stories of lynchings and massacres justified by the claim that someone had threatened white womanhood. The fact that Victoria and I had done nothing improper wouldn't matter if the wrong people decided to make an issue of it. "I'll keep my distance," I agreed, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. But Victoria Sterling, as I was learning, was not a woman who accepted other people's decisions about her life without a fight. The next morning, she appeared at the corral as usual, dressed in her riding clothes and carrying a thermos of coffee that smelled like heaven. "You're avoiding me," she said without preamble, settling onto her usual perch on the fence rail. "Yesterday you barely looked in my direction, and when I tried to speak with you, you found urgent business elsewhere." I continued working with the young mare, not trusting myself to look at Victoria directly. She was wearing a soft yellow blouse that brought out the gold in her hair, and the morning sun created a halo effect that made her look like some sort of angel descended to earth to torment me. "I have work to do, Miss Sterling. Perhaps you should find other entertainment." She was quiet for so long that I finally had to glance her way. She was studying me with those penetrating green eyes, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in her intelligent mind. "My uncle spoke to you," she said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Your uncle is a good man who cares about your welfare," I replied carefully. "My uncle is a coward who's letting men like Morrison dictate how I should live my life," she shot back, anger flashing in her eyes. "And apparently you're just as much a coward as he is." The insult hit home because there was truth in it. I was being a coward, taking the safe path, backing down from a fight I wasn't sure I could win. But I was also being practical, trying to protect both of us from consequences she was too sheltered to understand. "You think this is about cowardice?" I asked, finally facing her directly. "You think I'm afraid of Morrison and his threats? Aren't you?" I walked over to the fence where she sat, close enough that I could see the tiny freckles across her nose, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used. When I spoke, my voice was low and intense. "I'm afraid of what happens to you when the good people of this territory decide that Thomas Sterling's niece has been corrupted by savage influences. I'm afraid of what happens when your reputation is destroyed and you can't go back to your life in Boston. I'm afraid of what happens to both of us when men like Morrison decide that an example needs to be made." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw some of her anger fade as the reality of our situation began to sink in. But being Victoria Sterling, she wasn't ready to accept defeat. "So we just give up?" she asked. "We let small-minded men dictate who we can speak to, who we can be friends with?" "We survive," I said simply. "Sometimes that's all you can do." She slid down from the fence and moved closer to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "And what if I don't want to just survive? What if I want to live?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could feel the pull of her, the temptation to throw caution to the wind and damn the consequences. But I had responsibilities to my people, to the memory of warriors who had died defending their right to exist, to the future generations who would inherit whatever world we created. "Miss Sterling," I began, but she cut me off. "Victoria," she said firmly. "My name is Victoria, and I want to hear you say it." "Victoria," I said, and her name on my lips felt like a prayer. "You come from a world of privilege and safety. You can afford to take risks because you've never faced the consequences of being powerless. But I can't. My people can't. Every action I take reflects on every Apache who comes after me." The tears gathered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "So you're willing to sacrifice our friendship, whatever this is between us, to protect people who will never even know your name? If that's what it takes." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw a dozen emotions flicker across her beautiful face. Anger, hurt, disappointment, and something else that might have been respect. "You're more noble than I am," she said finally, "and more foolish." She turned to walk away, but paused at the gate of the corral. "You know what the real tragedy is, Takoda? You're the first man I've ever met who saw me as more than just a pretty face and a bank account. And I think I might be the first woman who saw you as more than just your ancestry, but we're both too scared to find out what that might mean." As she walked away, her head held high despite the tears I could see glistening on her cheeks, I realized that Victoria Sterling had just put her finger on the exact heart of our problem. We were both prisoners, she of her privilege and expectations, me of my heritage and the limitations it placed on my future. The question was whether either of us was brave enough to break free. Chapter 4. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning, when the desert wind carried the scent of rain and trouble in equal measure. I was working alone in the far pasture, repairing fence posts damaged in the last storm, when I heard the sound of galloping horses approaching at dangerous speed. Victoria appeared over the ridge, riding her uncle's best stallion bareback like some ancient warrior goddess, her golden hair streaming behind her in the wind. She pulled up beside me in a cloud of dust, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked like desperation. "They're coming for you," she gasped, sliding down from the horse. "Morrison and 6 men from town. They're saying you attacked me, that you compromised my honor." Ice formed in my veins despite the heat of the desert sun. "Did you?" "Of course I didn't," she snapped. "I told my uncle the truth, that we've barely spoken in days. But Morrison has been spreading lies, and now half the territory believes them. They're talking about justice, about making an example. A lynch mob." The words hung unspoken between us, but we both understood what was coming. I had seen the aftermath of such justice before. Good men strung up on the word of liars and cowards, their only crime being the wrong color skin at the wrong time. "You have to run," Victoria continued, grabbing my arm. "Take one of the horses and head for the mountains. My uncle sent me to warn you. He's trying to slow them down, but he can't hold them forever." I looked into her desperate green eyes and felt something shift inside my chest, like a dam finally giving way after holding back years of careful control. Here was this privileged, beautiful woman risking everything to save a man her own society had condemned. She had ridden hard across dangerous territory, probably ruining her expensive clothes and certainly her reputation, all to give me a chance at life. "Victoria," I said quietly, "why are you doing this?" She stared at me for a moment, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths, her cheeks flushed from the wind and fear. "Because someone has to. Because you're a good man who deserves better than this. Because She stopped herself, biting off whatever words had been about to tumble out. "Because what?" She closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, then looked at me with an expression so honest and vulnerable it took my breath away. "Because I've fallen in love with you, you impossible, noble, stubborn man. And I can't bear the thought of losing you to their hatred." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had suspected, had hoped maybe, But hearing her say it out loud changed everything, because the truth was, I had fallen just as hard for her. Somewhere between her defense of me against Morrison and her refusal to accept the easy answers, she had worked her way past all my carefully constructed walls and claimed a piece of my heart. But love didn't change the reality of our situation. "Victoria," I began, but she pressed her fingers against my lips to stop me. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't tell me all the reasons why this is impossible. Don't remind me about our different worlds or what people will think. I know all of that, but I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't." I caught her hand in mine, holding those soft fingers against my lips for just a moment before gently pulling them away. "And what I feel for you is real too. But love isn't always enough, especially when the world is determined to destroy it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but her voice remained strong. "Then at least let me help you escape. Let me do this one thing." That's when I heard them. The sound of many horses approaching fast, voices raised in anger and anticipation. Morrison's mob had found us. "It's too late," I said, moving protectively in front of Victoria. "They're here." 7 men crested the hill, led by Jake Morrison on his big bay horse. They were armed with rifles and rope, and their faces carried the ugly excitement of men who had convinced themselves they were doing righteous work. When Morrison saw Victoria standing beside me, his expression darkened with something that went beyond simple racism into personal hatred. "Well, well," he called out as they surrounded us. "Looks like we caught them together after all. Makes things nice and neat, doesn't it, boys?" "Mr. Morrison," Victoria said, stepping forward with all the authority her family name could command, "this has gone far enough. I demand you return to the ranch immediately and cease this ridiculous persecution of an innocent man." Morrison's laugh was ugly and cold. "Innocent? Miss Sterling, maybe you've been out in the sun too long. This savage has been filling your head with lies, taking advantage of your feminine nature. But don't you worry, we're going to cure you of these unnatural feelings." "The only unnatural thing here is your hatred," she shot back. "Takoda has done nothing wrong." "He's an Indian who forgot his place," Morrison snarled, "and you're a white woman who's been corrupted by savage influences. Time to restore the natural order of things." One of the men threw a rope over a sturdy cottonwood branch, while others trained their rifles on me. I could see the bloodlust in their eyes, the excitement that came from having permission to commit violence in the name of civilization. But I wasn't the same man who had first been forced onto the reservation years ago. I was Apache, descended from warriors who had fought the Mexican army and the American cavalry with equal ferocity. If I was going to die today, I wouldn't go quietly. "Victoria," I said softly, not taking my eyes off Morrison. "When I move, you run for the horse. Don't look back, don't try to help, just run." "No," she whispered, "I won't leave you." "You will," I said firmly, "because your life has meaning beyond this moment, because you have the power to change things, to make sure this kind of hatred doesn't win." Morrison was dismounting now, the noose in his hands. "That's real touching," he sneered, "but playtime's over. String him up, boys." That's when Victoria Sterling did something that shocked everyone, myself included. She pulled a small derringer from her riding jacket and pointed it directly at Morrison's chest. "Touch him, and I'll kill you where you stand," she said, her voice deadly calm. "I may be just a weak woman, but I'm also an excellent shot, and this gun is loaded." The mob froze, uncertain how to handle this unexpected development. Morrison's face cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "you don't want to do anything rash. Put the gun down and we can forget all about this unfortunate incident." "The only thing I want to forget is the sight of your ugly face," she replied. "Now mount up and ride away, or I swear by everything I hold dear, I'll put a bullet through your black heart." For a long moment, nobody moved. The desert wind stirred the dust around us, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out its hunting call. Then Morrison's calculation reached its inevitable conclusion. "You won't shoot," he said with growing confidence. "You're a lady, and ladies don't kill people. That's just not in your nature." Victoria's smile was cold as winter starlight. "Mr. Morrison, you've made two critical errors in your assessment of my character. First, you assumed that being a lady means being weak. Second, you assumed you knew anything about my nature." She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder, and Morrison's hat flew off his head. A neat hole burned through the crown. He stumbled backward, his face pale with shock and sudden fear. "The next one goes through your heart," Victoria said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. "Would anyone else like to test my ladylike nature?" The mob was already backing away, their courage evaporating in the face of a woman who had just proven she was willing to kill to protect what she loved. Morrison tried to rally them, but the fight had gone out of them. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving threats and curses in their wake, but no longer willing to risk their lives for the pleasure of hanging one Apache. When they were gone, Victoria finally lowered the gun, and I saw her hands were shaking. "I've never shot at a person before," she whispered. "I wasn't even sure I could do it." I took the derringer from her trembling fingers and pulled her into my arms. She melted against me, finally allowing herself to show the fear she had hidden so well. "You saved my life," I murmured into her hair. "You magnificent, impossible woman." "I love you," she said fiercely, pulling back to look at me. "I don't care what the world thinks about it. I love you, and I'm not going to apologize for it anymore." "And I love you," I replied, finally allowing myself to say the words that had been locked in my heart. "More than my own life, more than my pride, more than the fear that's kept me silent." She rose up on her toes and kissed me then, there in the middle of the desert with the dust of a lynch mob still settling around us. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and gunpowder, and the promise of a future that neither of us had dared to imagine. When we finally broke apart, she smiled up at me with those green eyes that had captured my heart from the first moment I saw her. "So what do we do now?" "They'll be back, probably with more men." I looked toward the mountains where my people lived, then back at the ranch that had been my home for the past 3 years. The old world was ending, but maybe, just maybe, we could build something new from its ashes. "Now we run," I said, taking her hand. "We find a place where love matters more than bloodlines, where a man is judged by his character instead of his ancestry. And if no such place exists," I smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in years, "then we create one." As we rode toward the mountains together, Victoria's golden hair streaming in the wind behind us, I realized that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dominating others, but from having the courage to be dominated by love. She had set out to tame an Apache warrior, but in the end she had done something far more dangerous. She had freed his heart, and in return I had done the same for her.